It's an odd thing that we tend to think, or Western cultures tend to think of art as a kind of luxury. Um, Whether you look at contemporary art, um, which is, or Renaissance art, which is in the form of closed images, paintings and sculptures in their frames and on their plinths, which can be traded as a commodity. And the thing that they contain, the thing that they produce, the sensation they produce is very lovely, but it's the sort of thing that you have to put on to one side if you want to fight a war. Um, and and then as for the art of the past, the art of the caves, the art of the temples, and so on, well, that's all a bit, it's all very wonderful, but it's a bit primitive and to do with magic. And certainly you can't invoke magic if you want to wage a war, uh, or even if you want to feed your economy. So in the main, we don't see any kind of evolutionary purpose for art. Yet it is there from the beginning, from the first time when when speech manifested itself, language manifested itself, and modern man began to emerge, and woman, of course. Art has always been present. How is it that in the rough and tumble world of our biological and cultural and ecological evolution, somehow in that scramble for existence, somehow there's always art? What role is it actually playing in the business of evolution? Well, I try and show you in this talk, suggest to you that art is a kind of shape changer, and as such, it's an evolutionary enabler. It's a kind of glue which spreads itself thickly in times of, and maximizes its presence in times of evolutionary ecological stability, times when for millennia at a time, we're all using the same ecology. And it minimizes itself, it gets out of the way during those periods when suddenly, for unknown reasons, a new ecology emerges. Now, this business of new ecology is, well, we're the only species that does it. We've only done it fully once when we moved from foraging into farming. It's risky, it's expensive, and it's extraordinarily disruptive while it happens. And we know about the disruption because we're still in the middle of the second ecological saltation, the switch from a manual to a machine ecology, which we initially called the Industrial Revolution, though it's become something much more embracing since we moved on from high energy, stupid machines to high energy machines managed by intelligent, low energy machines, which is where our ecology is going now, and for which we probably haven't altogether a name. But art, well, art appears in all these forms, but it changes shape. And it changes shape, I want to suggest to you, in a way significantly. But to understand that, first of all, we have to overcome the limitations of our own language. We only have the one word for art. And we have two distinctly different ways of producing it. My speciality is visual art, but the same applies to the generality of arts. We can produce art for aesthetic purposes in closed images, pre-prepared, pre-packaged, limited by the frame, unalterable, but there for contemplation. And a painting, a sculpture on its plinth is a closed image. No events can alter it, or if they do, it's destroyed or it has to be repaired. A play is a closed image, and a director can get in and change the costumes and change the feelings, but the script is the script, the score is the score in the opera, and so on. Essentially, the essence of it is there complete and can only be modulated slightly to the tunes of the times. And that's the way that we think of art. But in this sense, we are looking at art really through the wrong end of the evolutionary telescope, because art's default is not the production of aesthetic images. It is actually, it is the generation of ritual in open images, which involve usually some kind of immersive environment, and within that immersive environment, shared performance, shared activity, and a multidisciplinary activity of that. You could think of your local Anglican church service if you want to. It's not a hugely riotous form of a ritual, but it is exactly a ritual. It is an open image into which anyone can go who shares those beliefs, who can, anyone can take part, and indeed has to take part, even if only standing up and down for singing hymns and kneeling down for prayers and chanting amen, because much of the work in an Anglican service is done by the priest, sometimes by the choir, but you all have at one moment to stand up and confess or announce the belief. There is a limited degree of participation, and it is an immersion in an event. It is a ritual. And it is a different thing from a stationary work of art. And really, art's default position, if you look back over the millennia, is not in the production of closed aesthetic images to be valued for their beauty, but it is in the production of rituals. Go back to the caves 30,000, 40,000 years ago, of the hunters-gatherers, then going forward to the tomb and temple spaces of the agrarians. This is art in its default form, and it fragments from time to time into its aesthetic form. There was a period between the old Stone Age and the new, known sometimes the Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, where art it came out of the caves, it went back into the temples after a while, and in the interim period, it became something more decorative, more specialized for its beauty as addressed to the individual sense. And something similar has happened since the Renaissance 500, 600 years ago. Art has addressed itself. Art came out of the temples, out of the cathedrals, off the walls of those sacred spaces. It went into quasi-sacred spaces, palaces and art galleries, and was viewed in a quasi-ritualistic fashion. But it was valued now, not for its magical ability to transform souls from life to death and to redeem souls through the life-death cycle, but for the beauty of the image that it generated, for the surge and rush of pleasure that it gave to the mind's eye. So we have these two forms of art. And why do we have these two forms of art? Because our minds are in a curious way sensitive to our evolution. And we are the sole species which has the capacity to change its own ecology. We've only done it fully successfully once, some 10,000 years ago or more. We began to come out of hunting, gathering, and into farming, out of foraging, as somebody, into farming. That was the Neolithic or the Agrarian Revolution. And during that, the middle of that period, art sort of aestheticized itself briefly. It came out of the caves and then went into the temples and re-established itself as part of the immersive environment and became interactive again. So this movement between the contemplative and the ritualistic participatory forms of art is an ancient movement of the human mind. And I'll suggest at the end of this talk that we're moving again from the aesthetic to the ritualistic, and consider what that tells us about where our ecological evolution is now moving. Why do we have the two kinds of art? Because we're the only species that can change its own evolution. You can call it the human condition. You can call it the state of original sin. I can think of no real rational reason other than this, other than we can break our link with nature and remake it, that justifies the guilt expressed by so many religions about the state of being human. We did that extraordinary, wonderful, and terrible thing, and it lives with us, this capacity to change our own relationship with nature, to change our own means of production on a species-wide collective basis. And the reason why we have the two kinds of art is that this happens, it's not a gradual process. Of course, everything is molecular change at the very bottom, but it is a punctuated process when you look at it on the human scale. That is to say that we go through periods of disruptive, innovative change, like the change from foraging to farming, and like the Industrial Revolution, the change from a manual to a machine ecology. And those periods create their own specific kind of cultural selection. It doesn't do during those periods of dynamic change to have your beliefs all locked into a single system, and your relationships with the biosphere and the greater universal environment cast into a single system of belief. Ritualistic systems get in the way during periods of dynamic change and disruptive, innovative change, and they give a lot of problems. We all remember the argument about whether art should be in the picture or out of the picture during the Reformation, and in practice now the world is getting a lot of trouble from fundamentalists of all religions who want to cling on to the old thinking of the old agrarian ecology, when we're moving our relationship to another one, which where machines stand between us and the environment, and where we have somehow to adapt our minds, our psyches, and our culture to that altered kind of existence. And it's not helped by pulling back on the past and trying to retrieve the past to smother the present and hide the future. And our art is a sensitive beast. It's a sensitive creature. There is something about the act of creation that makes artists, and in the parallel way scientists for that matter, but we're looking at the arts here, that makes artists responsive, particularly responsive in their imagery to the way the world, the dynamics of the world are unfolding. And so it is that we get that in this cycle of punctuated evolution, we get the oscillation of a ritualistic followed by an aesthetic followed by a new ritualistic art. And that is underlyingly driven by what I might call the scarcity to super scarcity curve of economic growth. That is to say that when our species, when a population within our species discovers a new form of a new way of producing its means of survival, which is more competitive, which gives it an edge over all its contemporary populations, then that creates for that fortunate population an age of plenty, because the whole resources of the rest of the world are available, and that gives that funds the production of surplus value, which in turn funds the production of the production of new forms of the ecology. So ecologies of ages of plenty drive growth, but ages of plenty have their limits. In the end, every new ecology globalizes once again removes from the world that body over which it had the advantage because it has assimilated it. In the case of the Industrial Revolution, we are now all of us industrialized from pole to pole, from equator to the other side of from hemisphere to hemisphere. We're all of us industrialized. We're all of us in that net of, possibly you may call it, the post-industrial. We're all using and used by the same intelligent machines, which are driving the heavy machines, which finally produce our subsistence. So we have an old scarcity giving way to a new plenty, rising to a kind of super plenty for those who are privileged to profit by it. And the super plenty giving way to a new, still newer, super scarcity. Scarcity at the higher ecological level. And ages of plenty are ages of dynamic growth. And ages of scarcity are necessarily ages of more conservative economic equilibrium. Indeed, it's one of the curiosities of modern economics that economists, in what has been a defining age of plenty, even super plenty, still use the equilibrium model in their thoughts, though its equilibrium was actually destroyed by the disruptive forces of ecological change. And we're only now, once again, as I'll suggest at the end of this talk, moving towards a new economic equilibrium. So we have this alternating pattern of stability, rather stable evolutionary dynamics, followed by very dynamic change, followed by rather conservative change again. So the mind, the human mind, is going between a stable world, dynamic world, and a stable world. Now, let me give you a model. Think of a motorway. Think of a motorway bridge. Think yourself into the position of somebody standing on that motorway bridge and looking down on the traffic. We've all seen them do it. And you're in a static environment, but moving traffic. And it's the moving traffic, the dynamic element, that is the attractor. But if you now get down onto the motorway and in your car, now the environment is flashing by. But the attractor for you, if you drive safely, is the relatively stable pattern of relationships you manage to maintain with the cars traveling with you at more or less the same velocity as you. And if people suddenly change velocity, break that stable pattern, we say correctly that they're driving dangerously. In other words, we perceive, we give our attention to dynamic figures in static fields and static figures in dynamic fields. And this appears to be the responsivity, reflexivity that drives the changes in art, so that we produce open images in periods of rather stable closed evolution, and we produce closed images in periods of rather open dynamic evolution. And that cycle completes itself when we go into super scarcity, into a new age of closed and relatively stable evolution, and art shifts back to the giving its attention to the open, the dynamic, and and becomes an event rather than an object. An event surrounded by objects, but essentially an event, and which we are all participators. And even in the age of rapid change, which we've all come through, we don't abandon this habit. Our homes are still temples and still caves. Our private lives, our social groupings, our social classes even, are still in their own way enclosures, which are open images into which everyone with the same system of beliefs, same idiom, can retreat. So it is not just that art is alone in changing between the open and the closed image. We all do it at different levels, but art is a collective voice. Art speaks for the community and in its own way serves the community by minimizing itself into the aesthetic form during periods of cultural change, and then going back into its maximized form, the open images, the large immersive environments in periods of greater stability. And what we're seeing in contemporary art at the moment is the gradual breakdown of the old aesthetic form of art, epitomized in the Renaissance, which picked up on a temporary proto-industrial period in classical culture a couple of millennia before, and replicated that. And then we've seen that deconstructed, and the art object gradually turn into a process, and the process gradually modulate in concept art into something indeterminate between art and not art, between the object and the event. And are presently be seen now as a prelude to a new transition towards the ritualistic. But why ritualistic? What is the function of ritualistic art? Well, again, we go back to the nature of art itself. Art is the other use of our brain. Our culture gives value to the rational use of the brain, the capacity to divide and keep separate positives and negatives. As Aristotle said, an object cannot both have and not have the same property. That's rational thought. But we also think relationally. In relational thought, and the relational brain unifies objects, positives and negatives. And it's an extraordinary lack of our society that we are not able to objectify that second capacity of our minds, which is the capacity that generates the sense of beauty, the sense of love, the sense of loyalty, and in a broad sense, the sense of religious rapture. So we have to think, first of all, that we have a capacity in our minds for reconciling contradictions, for bringing together into one equilibrium space the positives and the negatives, life and death. And indeed, if you go back to the Christian Mass, the Eucharist is a symbol of both life and death, death in life and life in death. And life and death are both realities, but the Eucharist creates a trans reality where life and death are both as one. And it is possible to pass relatively painlessly between the two phases of the contradiction. And that is how we use the trans-real, the religious image to mediate the grief and the awful contradictions of life. And indeed, the purpose of ritual in the sense of binding whole communities together in shared belief systems is to compensate for our inability in periods of scarcity to develop dynamic, innovative new forms of ecology, to overcome our adaptive strategy, our adaptive challenges. In periods of scarcity, we are much more exposed to the adaptive challenges which our world throws up, and we need to adapt inwards because we cannot adapt externally in the same way. And ritual is about the production of inwards reconciliation, the internal reconciliation of opposites, of the awful conflicts of life. It is how we manage our uncertainty in a profoundly uncertain world, and manage to live through it with a certain degree of courage and dignity when we're very lucky. So the purpose, the way that art switches between its open and its closed form, between its aesthetic and its ritualistic, is not only shifting that delivery of reconciliation of conflicts from a small area and from individual perception to collective belief and communal perception. But it is also, in one sense, getting out of the way while rational change goes forward, and in the other phase, bringing art back into the picture, into the center of the picture, maximizing art as the new ecology stabilizes and our power to influence it diminishes. That is not to say that we don't accrue innovation, or put it more accurately, we don't accrue self-similarity. Once we have developed a new ecology, we enrich it and enrich it and enrich it, as you can see in the old worlds of the past. If we look at Egyptian culture, or ancient Chinese culture, or ancient Pacific Polynesian culture, and so forth. These are enormously rich patterns of belief. So they may have begun with the violence of the Reformation and Puritanism and so forth. They may have begun with the stripping away of old systems of belief, but they have settled into, in their turn, effective ways of managing the gross uncertainty, the awful loneliness and struggle to which all of we individuals are exposed on our journey through from life to death. So art is really a kind of evolutionary enabler. It gets out of the way when it's in the way to allow change to occur, while we have the capacity, the plenty to drive change, and then it comes back into position and to play a major cultural role in the ages of super scarcity, when we have globalized a new ecology and we're all locked into the same pattern and no longer able to alter, to innovate our way out of trouble, and have instead to manage our lives in a certain state of passivity and humility, recognizing the vast oceanic uncertainty in which we are surrounded.